Hello everyone and welcome to Advanced Care Planning, Your Life, Your Choice. Today we'll take you through some of the basic principles of advanced care planning and provide some useful tips and advice for those starting out. Hopefully we can demystify and shed some light on this subject that's not always well understood. My name is Dr. Karen Dettering and I'm the Medical Director of Advanced Care Planning Australia. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we're meeting today and to pay our respects to elders past and present. I would also like to extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Today I'm fortunate to be joined by three panellists. So I have author and media professional Kelly Curtin, so welcome Kelly.
Thank you.
I have Chief Advocate for National Seniors Australia Ian Henschke, welcome Ian.
Hello.
And I have Mary Reynolds, who is a nurse and who's going to share a story today as well. So welcome, Mary. So thank you to you all for joining me today and sharing your personal experiences around advanced care planning. Whilst there's plenty of information and research around advanced care planning, it's through personal stories and through experience that we can better understand the value of advanced care planning and its benefits that it can bring to people and I think most particularly to loved ones during the most challenging events during life. So what I'd like to do first is to start with a little bit of an introduction around advanced care planning. So what is advanced care planning? In its simplest form or simplest term, advanced care planning is about an individual's plan for their future health care. It prepares the person themselves and others for events and situations, particularly preparing for a time where the individual themselves may not be able to speak for themselves. It is often useful at the end of life, but it can be used at any time in the future where the person's unable to make their own decisions. And we may need advanced care planning because of sudden events that happen, or maybe progressive illness, or it may be conditions such as dementia as well, where advanced care planning may be relevant. It promotes care that's consistent with a person's goals and values and beliefs and their particular preferences for care. And it prepares others, including decision makers, for the decisions that they may need to have. And what is an advanced care directive? Essentially, an advanced care directive is a written record of preferences for future care. These are available throughout Australia, although the specific terminology does vary a little bit throughout Australia, and we'll give you a bit more information about this later. And advanced care directives are able to record your values and life goals and preferred outcomes for care. And in your advanced care directive, you can also formally appoint what we call a substitute decision maker. And a substitute decision maker is the person that can make healthcare decisions on behalf of yourself. And they can be formally appointed. And you can actually choose who your substitute decision maker is. And again, we'll touch on this a little bit later on today in the webinar. So what we're going to do today is our three panelists have all been touched by advanced care planning and they're each going to share their experience. So I'm first going to start with Kelly. So again, welcome Kelly. And Kelly, I understand that you've actually written a book, What I'll Wear to Your Funeral, about your mother facing a life-limiting illness. And we'd appreciate if you'd share a little bit about your mother's story with us today.
Well, I think, the book, the title alone, What Will I Wear to Your Funeral, you don't have to guess that it's actually about death. And, my whole life, my mother was quite open about the fact that dying was a part of life. And over the years, she'd say things like, play this at my funeral, or, I know I want to be cremated, general sort of things. So I knew that if anything happened suddenly that she didn't want to have her life prolonged. But it wasn't until she was diagnosed with breast cancer for a second time that we really started to have useful and meaningful conversations about what she wanted in her healthcare and how she wanted her life to end, whenever that ended up being. So some of the conversations we were having were, she wanted to let me know when she thought enough would be enough. Quality of life is different for everybody, but for her it was about being physically able and mentally able, and if she couldn't continue the life that she had enjoyed, she didn't want to participate. And whilst she was very open to treatment and being around for as long as she could. She wanted to let us all know that when she no longer had a good quality of life, she wanted it to end quickly, and she wanted us to support her in that. So, and I'm really glad she did, because in those conversations I learnt things that I never would have known otherwise. I wouldn't have known that she wanted to die at home if she could. So the conversations in the book are about dying, and conversations about dying people find so fearful to have. So, but it's through those conversations that the fear and emotional stress of when someone you love is dying, it was alleviated because we had them before the time came.
Mm-hmm. And it certainly sounds like your mum was really clear about what she wanted from what you're describing.
Yeah, really clear. She continued to have a good quality of life, but she was clear that she wanted it to be quick. She was clear that she wanted to receive palliative care at home. She was clear that she didn't want visitors in her final days, which is something I would never ever have anticipated. My natural reaction would have been to allow a few close family and friends to come, but she was adamant. I knew that she didn't want anyone else. She didn't want other things immediately after her death. She didn't want a viewing. So it wasn't just about her actual final few days, it was the whole dying process that she was very clear about, and it gave me a great sense of relief and comfort knowing that I was actually carrying out her wishes that weren't necessarily my wishes, but it made for a very peaceful end.
And it certainly sounds like those conversations included many things, not just specific information about the medical treatment, but about other things that were really important to your mother as well. And I think it's important that those things can be part of advanced care planning for many people as well. I think the other thing, as a doctor, I've seen far too often people who haven't had the opportunity to have these conversations then left trying to guess what their loved one would want. And I think that's a really hard and tough place to be, particularly when, as you say, dying isn't necessarily a happy event. But if we can have these conversations, hopefully we can at least make them make the situation more straightforward at the time that it's actually happening. And ideally, we often encourage people to write these things down in an advanced care directive, but the conversations themselves are the critical component of all of this as well. And just writing a directive without the conversation is unlikely to make the difference, but we can have the conversation without necessarily writing everything down.
I did actually write it down through my own choice. It was literally just on a notebook when I was having conversations with her, because it is an emotional time and there's so much else going on with someone's medical care and just logistics that I didn't want to forget.
Yes. Yeah.
So it was a great point of reference that I didn't have to second guess what she wanted.
And Ian, your family has also been touched by advanced care planning. Can you tell us a little bit about your brother Richie and the plans that he had put in place before he died?
Well, I was a journalist too, like Kelly, so I ended up writing down my story as well, and maybe that's how we deal with grief. But I did write down a story last year called What I Learned from Richie. And Richie was my oldest brother that was alive. My mother's first boy died, and then she had Richie, and then she had Philip, and then she had Mark, and then she had me. Mum had 5 boys in a row, no girls. So we're a very interesting family. So Richie had, I don't know what you'd say today, learning difficulties at school. He never got through primary school. In those days you had to get the progress certificate to make it to high school. He ended up getting work, unskilled work, and of course the Australian loves the smoko. And he was drawn into cigarette smoking very early on. Have a ciggy, Richie, and he wanted to be one of the men workers. So as a teenager, he started smoking. He then developed what is known as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Maybe you can correct me. Did I get it right?
You did get it right, Ian.
Right,
Absolutely
okay.
Perfect.
Well, it's called COPD. And every winter, as Richie got older, he would get sicker and sicker. So we knew that the inevitability was there. He didn't have lung cancer, but he had this disease which I understand is almost as bad as lung cancer in the number of people that it's actually killing, because it's affecting the quality of your life. So Richie started to lose his ability to breathe, and he would panic at night, and he would be constantly feeling as if he couldn't breathe properly. My two other brothers, Mark and Philip, both did medicine, so I didn't make a hat trick. But they sat down with Richard and they actually went through and explained to him what would happen. I mean, what the progression of COPD is, and there's stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, just like cancer, I understand. But once again, you can correct me, am I right or not?
Well, yes, certainly it goes through various stages, and it is a progressive disease. And as you rightly said, many people progress, get very symptomatic and do die from the condition.
So this particular last time, and I'd got used to it going in and out of hospital and helping Richie and coming back and then him going in, but this particular last time he went down very rapidly, and I don't really remember, but there was a very bad flu season and there were a lot of people that were ill, and anyway he went down very quickly and he was in hospital, and my brother came down from interstate and said, where's the Advanced Care Directive? And this is something I'd like to raise too, because if it didn't go into the hospital with him when he was taken in by ambulance, and so we had to find it, and then he had to have it discussed with the doctor, he had to get the doctor there. But look, once my brother did that, and my other brother was there to back him up, we were able to get palliative care in place, and Richard was given what was necessary to keep him comfortable. But there were no extraordinary measures taken to keep him alive. He lost the ability to swallow, so there was no question that we were not going to put him onto some sort of artificial means of feeding. If he lost the ability to breathe, there was no question we were not going to be putting him onto a respirator. So we sat there over days, and I fed him a bowl of soup on Tuesday, and he died on the Thursday. And I'm sorry I get emotional thinking about it, but it's still very raw. And I wanted him to stay. I mean, I didn't want Richie to go. I didn't want him to go. So what made it so good, and what Richie's legacy was, he knew that we weren't going to be sitting there arguing about it, because he'd written down what he wanted. And I can't sit there and say to my brothers, well, put him on a respirator, keep him alive, because I said, no, this is what Richie wanted. This is what we discussed. So for me, an Advanced Care Directive means the difference between someone having a good death or three brothers sitting in a hospital arguing over what would have been. And if you know sibling rivalry in families, it's a pretty strong and powerful thing. So instead of pulling us apart, Richie's death brought us together, and so that's the great gift he gave me.
So as Ian, as you were discussing, there is research showing that advanced care planning can reduce the depression and the stress experienced at the time of these really difficult situations, and to try and reduce conflict and other things. And we also know from research that people are more likely to be satisfied with the quality of the death that actually occurs as well. So I think you've highlighted that even though all of this is really, really hard to go through, having the Advanced Care Directive gave you great comfort and relief at the time that it was really required. So Mary, I understand that you've also had an experience where you've been touched by advanced care planning, so perhaps you could share a little bit about your story as well.
Yeah, happy to. Slightly different story. One day I received a phone call from the police saying that I needed to get myself to a hospital rather quickly. There'd been an incident. I arrived at the hospital to discover that my husband's heart had stopped. He'd been resuscitated, but the outlook wasn't fantastic. After normal medical procedures for that time, where they did what they had to do to try and see if he could come back to being himself, that it became very quickly obvious that that wasn't going to happen. And for me, Lloyd, my husband, and I had had several conversations about what was an acceptable level of health, about dying, about medical interventions, over our time we'd had. I can't even count how many conversations. We'd had conversations before we got married. And so at that time it was a very simple decision to say, well, actually, whilst I would dearly love him to stay alive, him staying alive in the condition that he was going to come out in was certainly not the state he would ever want to be in. He was going to be very, very unhappy. And it was going to be a struggle for him. So to communicate that to the medical professionals, but also to his 5 brothers and sisters and his mother, was an interesting discussion, but I felt very empowered because I knew down to my socks exactly what he wanted, exactly what decisions he would want made on his behalf to give him the life that he wanted. And the life that he wanted wasn't to be stuck in a bed, it wasn't to be taking pills at lunchtime, it wasn't to be able to have someone put his socks on for him. He was a sort of man who enjoyed his independence, he enjoyed using his brain, and to be able to do those things for himself was paramount, and that was never going to be the case again. So we let nature take its course and he died. At the time our youngest child was 16, and the eldest was 24, and it was a very interesting time. But I'm still, to this day, very glad they were the decisions I made. Still miss him. Strangely, we'd had a conversation 2 days prior to the incident, which was just coincidental. No one's got a crystal ball, but we had a conversation 2 days prior. That's incredible, but I'm glad we did.
And Mary, I think your story highlights very much that this can happen to anyone at any time, and people do have preferences and values and particular things that they'd like to happen, and I think it's really important. And I think the other thing it highlights is that it's about following what you believe his preferences would be, not necessarily what you want, but what his preferences were.
I do firmly believe that it's, in this particular case, his body, his life, so therefore I should follow his choices. Yeah. And I hope someone can do that for me.
Yeah. And Mary, I understand that following your husband's death, you talked about some of the family members getting involved, but I understand you've also taken some further steps with advanced care planning as well.
Yeah, I have. My son, as I said at the time, was 16. He has grown up to be a fantastic 22-year-old. And in that time, we've had conversations about Lloyd dying and about what would happen if similar things happened to all of us. My daughter, who is 3 years older than my son, is a less self-confident person than my son. My son also he's not frightened of things, whereas our daughter tends to shy away from things. And appointing my son as my substitute decision maker whilst he doesn't fit the hierarchy means that he's got a big burden on his shoulder, but I also know that he's the right person to make those decisions. He's not going to be frightened, he's not going to second guess himself. He's got to make the decisions that he believes is the right things at the time and be able to live with those decisions.
So I think, again, you highlight the importance of actually choosing your decision maker rather than just the default, which is a decision maker is chosen for you. So, it's important to choose the decision maker that you trust to make the decisions on your behalf. And I think you've highlighted a number of the characteristics that you might look for in a decision maker, including being able to act in that role, because clearly these are tough decisions, and so you need somebody that you feel can do that. And so in all states and territories in Australia, you can legally appoint a medical decision maker, and it can be a family member, but it doesn't need to be. And again, the information is all available, so that if people do want to do this, it certainly can be done, and we try and demystify the steps and make it as easy as possible for these things to occur.
It'd be really nice to see the conversation about care towards the end of life and the dying process being more of a normal conversation instead of something that happens when someone is near the end of life. Yeah. And everyone handles things differently. My oldest brother couldn't have that conversation easily, but he put his feelings in a letter. So it was still conveyed, but just differently. And there's no doubt that talking about someone that you love, being in a situation that will most likely result in their end of life, it's confronting and emotional. But, you know, sometimes if you're having that conversation when it's not at that time, when it's much earlier, when it's just part of normal conversation, not that it's every week, but every now and then, you know, you might have had a preference for one type of care and it changes. But if that is not so much of a taboo, and that it can be had in general conversations with the people that are important to you, then there can be a few laughs along the way, and you learn things about people you love that you didn't know.
I agree completely, and you know, people often ask me a little bit about how did I get involved in this area, and working as a doctor, I have just seen so many situations where families have not had the conversation and they're in an impossible situation trying to work out what is the decision, and maybe there's dispute amongst the different family members, and I just think, gee, this is just so hard and so impossible. And so having an earlier conversation might be difficult, but it's going to be much more difficult not having the conversation. And the other thing I think I've learnt along the way with this journey that I've taken in teaching people to have these conversations is actually often the conversations are nowhere near as hard as we think they're going to be. And they are just an incredible act of love for our family members and our friends, those that we think are really important.
And I don't know about I think all of us here, because those conversations, that hard stuff have been done before, that in the moment of death can actually be really quite peaceful and beautiful, and you were with your brothers, I had my brothers holding our mother's hand, and you were there with your husband, and and that's the way it should be. I mean, we're all going to die, and yet we still can't seem to talk about it.
And I think peaceful is a good way to describe how I felt when it was all over. There was no second guessing. I miss him, but I still feel I made the right decisions, and so peaceful is probably the best way to describe that.
So thank you for sharing your stories and for the discussion. We might just find any final words, perhaps first Kelly, any final words for our audience today?
Well, my tip would be that there's no denying that conversations about dying and death are confronting and emotional, but they're so important to have, and they don't need to be nearly as bad as you think they'll be if you pour a wine and gather those you love around and discuss it before it's at a critical point.
Thank you. And Ian?
Well, I think you should write things down and talk about them, so I think you've got to do both. So having the conversation with the kids, even though my children are only one's not even a teenager yet, but I mean, she still understands the difference between life and death. We buried one of her pet chickens the other day, and we talked about how the chicken was getting ill and how she hadn't been well, and I said what a great carer she was, and she loves these animals, and so through those acts we discussed life and death, and we talked about Richie's death. She came into the hospital and saw him, so you can have a conversation with a 12-year-old.
And Mary?
For me, advanced care planning isn't always about death. Advanced care planning is about your life and how you want to live it. And so I think having the conversation about your standards, your values, what's important to you is also important and part of the conversation. And I think it's a very important part of the conversation. So if it's a difficult conversation to have, start about life, because death's always going to be difficult. So my tip, my advice, my last thoughts is have a conversation about what's important in your life.
Thank you for sharing your stories today and your insights and the discussion. So if you want further information, you can ring the Advanced Care Planning Advisory Service, and you can see the number there on your screen. And people, health professionals, carers can ring this number and get advice, and we'll head you back to relevant resources in your state or territory. The Advanced Care Planning Australia website has lots of useful information. It has some other videos that you can watch. It also has information about how to get started with advanced care planning, or perhaps how to take it further. It also has links to all the forms in all the different states and territories in Australia if you actually want to take this further. On the Advanced Care Planning Australia website, there's also some information about how you can actually upload your Advanced Care Directive into your My Health record if you have one. And if you don't have a My Health record, you will have one soon, hopefully. And that's a great place to put your Advanced Care Directive.